Hello, everyone. I'm Richa Nigam from NSE CBS, and we welcome everyone to the second installment of our conference series, uh, Behavioral Science in Marketing. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome our chair, Professor Arvind Sahay, and the executive members from NSE CBS, and all the associates who have so fondly joined this conference. And I would also like to take the opportunity to welcome Toby, who is our sponsor for the best paper, and they are sponsoring the award for excellence in research by Toby Pro. So, NSC Center for Behavioral Science in Finance, Economics, and Marketing addresses the issues related to business and uh, how how different how behavioral science can actually uh, be used in the areas of finance, economics, and marketing. So now I would want to welcome Professor Arvind Sahay to take over and give a keynote address to the conference. Professor Sahay.
Thank you, Richa. Um, so my name is Arvind Sahay. I head up the NSE Center for Behavioral Science in Finance, Economics, and Marketing here at IIMA Ahmedabad. The center was started a couple of years ago with a generous grant from NSE, and now in business schools in India, it is one of the facilities that exist with equipment like eye tracker and EEG and GSR, some basic tools that are used quite widely both in academic research and in business activities to generate insights, whether it is in marketing or HR or finance or economics and so on. So we started this series of conferences where we try to mix both academics and practitioners, bring them together on one platform to be able to share ideas. And this is the second in that series. And hopefully, we'll all be able to learn from the presentations and from the discussions that take place during this conference. So that's a little bit about the center. Welcome to all of you guys who have joined already. And let me now go into my speech that I have kind of prepared almost the last minute for this conference. I'm going to be talking about neuroscience and behavioral science and applications in business to kind of set the stage for the conference as a whole. Let me share my screen. Hopefully, this is going to be visible. Yeah, so that's what I want to be talking about for the next 45 minutes or so. If you have questions, I would request you to put them in the Q&A. And as I'm talking, I will try to view the Q&A part, and I will try to incorporate the responses to your questions in my talk as I'm doing the talk. So the Q&A box is open, and I think the chat box is also open. Between the two, please use only one. Q&A is where you should be putting your questions as we get going. Right now, I see no open questions, and so please do put your questions in there as we go along. I will monitor that as we go along. Okay, so what do we want to kind of share as a starter to the conference? For many people, neuroscience and behavioral science are separate. For many people, a question that arises naturally is, what is the linkage between the two? Because neuroscience is about the brain and behavioral science is much more application oriented. And so therefore, the first thing that we will address today is what is the link between neuroscience and behavior science. Having said that, gone through that fairly quickly, The next thing that we will talk about is, okay, so here is this link between neuroscience and behavioral science. How does the brain actually influence how we behave and behavioral science as a whole? And to understand that, we need to get a sense of what are key operating principles that the brain uses to work and that makes us behave the way that we do. And I use that phrase deliberately because ultimately our behavior is influenced by how we think, and we think inside our heads, we feel inside our heads. And just as a kind of a demonstration of that, we will look at the idea of emotional intelligence in decision making. What does that mean inside the head? When we say somebody is emotionally intelligent, what does it mean in neuro terms? What does it mean from a brain operating principle perspective? And what does it mean from the perspective of behavioral science? And then we'll close off by looking at a few applications in business, both from a research perspective as well as from an applications perspective. How you can apply neuroscience and behavioral science in business more generally, but in particular in marketing as well. So moving forward, therefore, to what is the link between neuroscience and behavioral science? The first thing that I would like to share with you is this picture. As you look at this picture, most of you guys will be seeing a triangle and a circle. You will be seeing two triangles, perhaps one on top of the other, and maybe three circles, and the triangles are kind of biting into the circle. Some of you guys may also be seeing smaller triangles because the two triangles are on top of one another. That creates some other triangles as well. However, if you continue to look at it more clearly, more closely, with greater attention and concentration, what you will see is that actually there are no triangles, there is no circle. What is actually drawn over there are three brackets and three Pac-Mans or diggers. I'm an old fellow. In my time, we used to play digger. Today, closer to today, I think play Pac-Man. So you have those three Pac-Mans and you have three brackets. But even after I have told you that there are no triangles and there are no circles, you are still seeing the triangles and the circles, right? Uh, I'm pretty confident that most of you guys would still be seeing the triangles and the circles. And therefore, the question that we want to ask is, why are we seeing the triangles and the circles if there are no triangles and circles, if there are only brackets and angles and Pac-Mans over there? I will leave you with this question for the moment, just as an illustration of the thought that our behavior might be determined by the fact that I see triangles and circles rather than brackets and a Pac-Man. And that behavior is influenced by the fact that my brain is seeing something that is not really there. And why it is seeing that, therefore, becomes an important question to ask. And that is something that we will look at as we go into how the brain works. Another illustration of the idea of linking neuroscience and behavioral science is this question that I have put before you. Right? This question essentially asks that you are faced with either one of two situations. In one situation, you're walking on a road and you discover 2,000 rupees in 100 rupees. Clearly, this particular slide was written some years ago after the demonetization, because at that time, those were the two notes which were available. There was no 500 rupee note, right? So, if you were to discover 2,000 rupees, you will obviously feel happy. If you're an honest fellow, you will look around and you will see if there's someone who might have lost that money. You might even wait for a bit to see if someone comes to take the money. But ultimately, if you've got 2,000 rupees, you will feel happy. By the same token, if you have lost 2,000 rupees, you will feel unhappy. Now, 2,000 rupees, if you think about it, the value of 2,000 rupees is the same. It will buy you the same thing. So when you lose 2,000 rupees, the pain that you feel should be equal to the pleasure that you feel when you gain 2,000 rupees. Logically, that is what should make sense. The pain and the pleasure should be equal. But again, if I were to run a survey amongst you, there are around 75 odd people already here. If I were to run a survey amongst you, the likelihood is that I will find that 70-80% of you will say that the pain is more and the pleasure is less. And maybe around 10, 20, 30% might say that the pleasure is more. Why is this so? This is a manifestation of behavioral science. And again, it goes back to how our brains work. Our brains are wired to pay more attention to potential losses. Those losses can be life threatening. And from the perspective of the brain, it is just an organism's way of ensuring survival and reproduction at a very basic level. And so, therefore, we have this conundrum that even though 2000 rupees is 2000 rupees, I feel more pain when I lose 2000 rupees as compared to the pleasure that I feel when I gain 2000. So, pain I pay always more attention to. And so, therefore, the idea that our brains, we need to understand our brain, how our brain works, uh, why does it behave the way that it does? And very briefly, that's inside all of us, a forebrain, a midbrain, a hindbrain. The hindbrain is the reptilian brain. It is the part which is the brainstem and the cerebellum, the dark purple part, where we have a lot of our unconscious uh, memories. So if you, some of you guys might have seen the movie Ghazni, for example. Mr. Ghazni could not form fresh memories. So if you met him, Sanjay Singhania in the movie, Amir Khan, if you met him and you talked to him for a while and you introduced yourself and then came away and went back to meet him after 10, 15 minutes or half an hour, he would not remember you because he could not form fresh memories. But if you met him and when you shook his hand, you poked his hand and then you talked to him and then you went away and came back, when you came back, Mr. Sanjay Singhania alias Asli would still not recognize you. But if you kind of put out your hand to try and shake hands, he would not want to shake hands with you because his unconscious mind memory at the back of his head remembers that you have poked him. He doesn't want to be poked again. But if you ask him why does he want to shake your hand, he won't be able to tell you why. Because there is no conscious memory. So that's your hindbrain. Then you have the midbrain, the U-shaped thing, the hippocampus and the amygdala. So they are involved in memory formation, conscious memory formation, and uh, emotional summaries of what you've done. And then the forebrain, that corrugated stuff that you see in brown, that's what makes us the pinnacle of the primate grouping, allows us to do reasoning, logic, personality, and decision making, and all of that. The part where we make decisions actually is fairly close to the midbrain and the hindbrain. And so a lot of our decision making is influenced by what's happening in the hindbrain and midbrain, which is something that we'll come to a little later. And when we make decisions, obviously we behave in those ways. And so when you look at behavioral science applications, ultimately at the back end, it is the brain that is driving the behavior. And so therefore the importance of understanding how the brain works, right? What are the operating principles, key operating principles of the brain? So, which brings us to the next part of the presentation, where we start talking about brain operating principles and how it influences decision making, and what is the influence of the operating principles on how we behave. So, what are brain operating principles? Very briefly, brain operating principles are a set of ideas that drive how the brain acts, why it acts the way it does, why, therefore, we behave the way that we do. And the key over here essentially is to figure out what is it that the brain does, right? So, what is it that the brain does? The brain has five key principles that I'm going to share with you. The first one is that it has some objectives, right? It has an objective function. Objective function is to feel good, survive, get rewards, etc., etc. The more important part is that when you feel good, when the brain feels good, then something is happening on the right side. It is having dopamine or serotonin or oxytocin or vasopressin and so on. So when you buy the car that you have been looking at for a while, you feel good. You get a surge of dopamine. When you check your bank account and you find that your money is more than what you had anticipated, you feel a little bit financially secure. You feel secure because the serotonin levels have just risen. When you get a hug from a loved one, then you feel rewarded. Why do you feel rewarded? Good, because oxytocin and vasopressin levels are going up. As an organism, the brain simply wants these neurotransmitters. The objective is to get these neurotransmitters, and so we do the behaviors that give us these neurotransmitters. And in business terms, therefore, in behavioral science terms, therefore, we tend to behave in the way that will give us these neurotransmitters. Of course, these neurotransmitters can come from less desirable activities also. But for the moment, we were not going to go into there. We're simply going to say that we have a situation that the brain wants neurotransmitters. Literally, if one were to inject you with dopamine or serotonin, you would feel good, you would feel secure. The second key idea is that the brain is an energy conserver. It doesn't like to spend energy. Concentration is hard. The brain would like to uh, keep the energy consumption at a stable level, 2% of the body weight, but 20 to 25% of the energy consumption. So how does it conserve energy? It pushes stuff into the unconscious. As we work on something, the brain is forever trying to see how it can be more efficient, and more efficiency means pushing stuff into the unconscious. The unconscious is more efficient. Conscious, deliberate attention requires a lot more effort. In fact, that's something that is something that is always there so far as the brain is concerned. Right? Conscious, deliberate attention is hard work, and it has a tendency to push stuff into the unconscious. It relies on emotions and reason. And so, therefore, from a behavior change perspective, from a behavioral science perspective, we always have to ask ourselves, how much of the behavior is conscious, how much of the behavior is unconscious, because the brain has a very natural tendency to push stuff into the unconscious. So, therefore, at a behavioral science level, at the level of marketing, for instance, how much of the intervention that I have, how much of the advertisement that I'm pushing, how much of the pricing that I'm pushing, how much of the investor behavior that I'm seeing is coming from the conscious versus the unconscious. And depending on that, my marketing intervention might happen or my behavioral science intervention might happen. And so, therefore, from a marketing perspective, since I'm a marketing professor, over time you can see that Nike, for instance, has pushed a lot of the stuff to the unconscious in the short run. Surf had a very nice campaign some years ago on Daag Achhe Hain, right? So all of these tend to grab your unconscious. Sometimes the consumer themselves push stuff into the unconscious, right? Maruti Suzuki, most of us unconsciously think that Maruti Suzuki is about small cars. It is not about expensive large cars. So if Maruti Suzuki tries to sell us a large expensive cars, we don't like the idea. Why don't we like the idea? Because in our unconscious, as consumers, we have bracketed Maruti as small, inexpensive cars. So that's the second operating principle, push stuff into the unconscious. The third one is patterns, right? I started the presentation by showing you something that looked like a triangle and circles, right? Triangles and circles. Why were you seeing the triangles and circles? Because the brain has a tendency to see patterns, to see groups. The brain has a tendency to try to categorize stuff. The brain has a tendency to see groupings, right? Why do we do that? Because when we see something and we can categorize it, then automatically I feel comfortable. It's not a threat. It is not something that I need to spend more energy over. So it is an energy saving device for us. That's why we see patterns. Sometimes there may not be a pattern out there. There were no triangles and there were no circles, but I'm still seeing it. Why am I still seeing it? Because it helps the brain to feel comfortable. And once I'm comfortable, then I need to spend less energy. Once I'm comfortable, I feel secure. My serotonin levels go up. So we are wired to see patterns. We always want to see patterns, sometimes even when there are no patterns. Interestingly, along with patterns, we also want to see contrasts, right? Our brain is wired to pay attention to anything that sticks out, anything that is different, anything that does not conform to groups, anything that is distance from a reference point, that is a peak, that is an extreme. We automatically pay attention because it gives us a sense of opportunity, of threat. We need to look at it. It's variety. It's different from what I'm used to. It gives me a dopamine spike. And so therefore I need to investigate. I need to find out. So patterns and contrasts come together, right? Sagar, I'll be with you in a moment. You can type your question. Uh, Patterns and contrasts kind of come together, right? So this particular example is from the Kumbh Mela, which was held a few years ago, and Unilever ran this interesting campaign, right? They heat stamped the chapatis which were being served in the Kumbh Melas with "Life Boy Se Haath Dhoya Kya." Now think about it. You're there with your friends and family in Kumbh Mela on the banks of the Ganges in a tent, and you're sitting down for food. Uh, and when we sit down for food, most Indians still eat with their hands. When we eat with our hands, then we need to wash our hands. So on the chapati, I'm seeing this message. Haath dhoya kya? Have you washed your hands? Unexpected, surprising, breaks the pattern. It doesn't normally happen. I pay a lot more attention to the message. And does it fit the pattern in a manner of speaking? Yes, because I'm supposed to wash my hands. It is a pattern of behavior that I always do. And so both the pattern and contrast are happening at the same time, which kind of pushes me to pay more attention. So, guys, if you have questions, can you just type them in the Q&A? I'm not sure that I can uh, hear you directly because this is a panel format. So, operating principles number 3, patterns and contrast. Our brain is looking for both at the same time. If you think about it, in marketing, this is the bottom line, right? If I want to sell something to a customer, it should have something different, but it should also not be so different that it makes the customer uncomfortable. So where is the balance at that point? How does the customer figure out, how do I figure out as a marketer how much should be similar to what is already existing and how much is different from what is existing? So if I want to sell you an electric motorcycle, and the electric motorcycle is supposed to be a substitute for a Pulsar or an Apache, then how much should the motorcycle be like the category that is represented by Pulsar and Apache, and how much can it be different? It already is going to be different because it's an electric motorcycle. Uh, and there will be some reservations that people will have about charging, about range, and so on. So I need to make people comfortable by trying to design it in a way so that it looks as if it belongs in that category of performance bikes. The last operating principle is what we call as mirroring, social confirmation, connecting. We have a natural tendency to mimic others, imitate others. That's how we connect with people. And it's called the mirror neuron system that we have. For those of us who are sports fans, you might have observed this in action when your favorite sports star does something good, like Ronaldo scores a goal, or Virat Kohli, Sachin Tendulkar score a six. Sometimes your hands and legs also move. Why are they moving as you're watching and you're engaged in watching that cricket match or football match? Because as you watch Ronaldo or Virat Kohli or Sachin Tendulkar or Rahul Dravid do what they are doing, your neurons also start firing. And normally you would not start doing the same thing that those guys are doing on the screen, but sometimes that switch which holds you apart breaks down, and you also do the same thing. So literally, the same neurons that Sachin is using to hit the ball, you are also using in your head at that point in time. So that's mirroring. Mirroring is the basis for learning, for connecting, for word of mouth, for influencer marketing, for a whole bunch of stuff, right? So those are the 5 operating principles on the basis of which the brain works, right? The first one is it wants neurotransmitters. I could literally inject you with neurotransmitters to make you feel the way that you would like. The brain conserves energy. It pushes stuff into the unconscious. The brain has a tendency to patternize, to see groups, categorize. The brain pays attention to contrast, peak shifts, extremes, whatever is different. And the brain has a natural tendency to mirror, to mimic. It's the basis of a lot of social action and behavior. Humans are said to be social animals. The reason we are social animals is that our brains are wired to connect. They are wired to connect to something. Recently, of course, along with connecting with people, we're also connecting with objects, brands, and so on. And the last part of this particular section of my presentation to you is how we make decisions. So if you look at how we make decisions, decision making is partly conscious and partly unconscious. You remember the idea that we had shared earlier in the talk when I said that the hindbrain is the place where you have some of your unconscious memories. So the unconscious memories can be a key driver of your decision making also. You're not aware that you have those memories, but that is driving decision making. You also have conscious reasoning. So you can see that a reasonably large proportion can come from conscious reasoning and also conscious emotion. But in no circumstance is our decision making only conscious. Also, sometimes, many times, on the other hand, our decision making can be completely unconscious. So the interesting point for us to think about is under what circumstances in business situations, in marketing situations, in behavioral science application situations, is the decision making conscious and unconscious? How much of it is driven by reason? How much of it is driven by emotion? What is the proportion that is coming from which box over here? Interestingly, now most scientists, neuroscientists, behavioral scientists are now veering around to the view that unconscious emotion is an integral part of every decision making. The number that I have put up there is 30% as a minimum, but it also some people say that it might be 20%, but nobody says that unconscious emotion is 0%. So the interesting point, therefore, for a particular behavioral science situation or a particular marketing situation, a particular human resource situation, a particular economic situation, especially behavioral economic situation, how much of the decision making is in which box, if you will, and therefore what should be, for example, a policy intervention or what should be a marketing intervention. And this leads us to the next question, which is, what are emotions? So emotions you can define as essentially a cocktail of neurotransmitters, right? When you're feeling good, you have one mix. When you're feeling happy, sad, angry, stressed, these are all a mix of neurotransmitters in your head. In more colloquial terms, we can say that you're having chemical locha in your brain, right? That is what is leading to emotion. Emotions can be happiness, can be sadness, they can be joy, they can be anger, there can be stress, there can be fear, and so on. And these are driven by, again, events and other dimensions which are happening. So if you're in a good, comfortable place, you will have a different kind of emotion. If you have a good mood, moods are different from emotions, by the way. You will have one kind of emotion. Certain personalities get more of one kind of emotion rather than other, whether you are an extrovert or an introvert, whether you are a risk averse person or a risk seeking person. And then, of course, culture. What is the culture that you come from? How did you grow up? What are some habits that you have formed? After all, what is culture? Culture is a set of procedural memories that you have formed, unconscious procedural memories that you have formed that allow you to behave in a particular way, mostly unconsciously. You don't even realize that you're behaving that way, but you are behaving that way because there's a whole bunch of wiring in your head that makes you behave that way automatically. And so these all of these taken together kind of lead to emotion. Emotion plus reason, an external event will ultimately lead to the decision. So there might be stimuli that's coming in the form of an advertisement, point of sale, communication, word of mouth. Your friend tells you something that leads to some kind of emotion, then you add in the reason and then you take a decision. So that, in a sense, gives you an idea of how the brain works, why the brain works in the way that it does. Uh, Brain operating principles, five of them. These are the key five that we want to talk about. The fact that it has objectives like feeling good, being rewarded. It has a tendency to push stuff into the unconscious because it is an energy conserver, that it wants patterns and contrast, and that it is something that mirrors other people, other things, and so on. And all of these taken together have a direct consequence for the behaviors that we do in different contexts. So if I'm going to be buying a bike, for example, an electric bike, for example, and I am somewhat environmentally conscious, right? I would seriously look at an electric motorcycle that may be say I'm also equally strongly looking at a performance spike in the 150cc to 250cc class. So if I'm looking at a performance spike in the 150cc to 250cc class, the candidates normally would be a Pulsar and Apache. Now, if you are normally looking at a Pulsar and Apache, but now maybe there is another one that is available which has a similar performance. It can give you the same acceleration, almost the same top speed. It looks like a macho, really nice looking bike. It claims a range of 160, 180 kilometers. It has swappable batteries, so one doesn't have to worry. And so, therefore, from the perspective of marketing, how do I set up things so that the combination of conscious and unconscious reason and emotion push people in the direction, influence people in the direction of going with this electric motorcycle? What is the messaging that I'm going to do? Which part of the messaging is going to appeal to the unconscious? Which part of the messaging is going to appeal to the conscious? Which part of the messaging is going to appeal to the reason? Which part of the messaging is going to appeal to the emotion? And the combination, therefore, I have to design for the target group. If I were an investor just now, and I'm trading on the markets, and I'm a company that has a set of investors I'm advising and managing portfolios for my clients. Therefore, my performance for the client is a function of how well my traders do on the market. So I need to have a sense of what drives the decision making of the traders. How do they make decisions? Are they influenced? They should be influenced more by conscious reason. But as we just saw, the brain doesn't work always that way. There is a fairly substantial input from the unconscious and from emotion. So therefore, I need to be able to train people to be able to detect and counteract and take emotion out of the picture as much as possible. It is not completely possible, but as much as possible, so that I can recognize the behavior of the market free of my own emotion. Very difficult to do. But the best traders, by the way, are the ones probably that are able to do this. By the way, this needs to be researched right now. This is a hypothesis. So if you want to take out emotion from your decision making, one of the questions that arises, therefore, is how does one become more emotionally intelligent? What is it that allows us to manage our emotions in decision making in a better way? So, what is emotional intelligence? What is the essence of emotional intelligence? We can say that it is about knowing and identifying feelings as they occur. A lot of us may not be able to identify feelings as they occur and knowing what is the feeling that I am feeling at a given point in time, and being able to live in the moment in a deeply engaged way. My mind is focused. It is in the moment, looking at what is happening just now rather than going into the past or future. And so it is a tool that allows people to be more aware of their own physical and emotional conditions without bogged down. And so therefore, you from the perspective of neuroscience, apparently it turns out that you need to use that you need to use the orbital cortex and the prefrontal cortex, the PFC. But if you are able to do that well, and there are many different ways of doing it, we are not going to spend time on that today. You become more mindful, and mindfulness, therefore, is a way to handle your emotions. And so, therefore, you can say that emotional intelligence is the ability to monitor and regulate one's own and others' feelings and utilize the results to guide human action. So, as a manager, if I'm trying to get a sense of what are the emotions driving the decisions of my customer, of my team members, of the public, then I'm able to design better marketing actions, better interventions, better behavior from myself so that I'm able to influence my team members. And, you know, any business presentation should have a 2x2 or at least more than one 2x2. So here's another 2x2 for you guys. So what are the tenets of emotional intelligence? You can say that it's about what I observe, how I act. It's about how I manage myself and how I manage others, social management and personal management. And empathy, I think you guys will understand what empathy is, self-awareness is, self-management is, and relationship management is. So it is taking all of these things together that leads to behaviors that can be termed as emotionally intelligent. And if one can be emotionally intelligent, then one is able to engage in behaviors that allows us to influence other people in a more productive way. That's some of the neuro part of it, where are the brain regions which are involved in emotional intelligence. So it's the MPFC, prefrontal cortex, part of the anterior cingulate cortex. So the anterior cingulate cortex, by the way, that you see is also where some of our personality resides. And emotional intelligence is also closely related to personality. The amygdala, many of you might have heard of the phrase amygdala hijack, when your emotions overwhelm you and you end up acting in a way that you might regret later. So now that we have a sense of how the brain works and how it influences behavior, so therefore, what are the different types of behaviors that can engage in? And we also kind of articulated that emotions have a significant role in decision making. And we said that this is how the brain is going to be intelligent, emotionally intelligent in the behavior. Let us now move to the last part of what we want to talk about today, which is applications in business, primarily marketing. So here are some thoughts that I wanted to share with you. So it turns out that we look at gains and losses in different circuits in the head. And for example, when I am buying something, I pay money. When I pay money, that is perceived as a loss, right? Now, the loss, perception of loss activates a different circuit in the head compared to the gain. And a preferred product will activate a different part of the brain, the NASE, the nucleus accumbens. And excessive prices might activate the anterior insula, which is where I perceive risk. So therefore, for us, if I am, let's say, trying to get an investor to invest in a particular product, a portfolio management service product, or a mutual fund, right? The customer in front of me, the investor in front of me, I'm the wealth manager, and I'm trying to persuade the investor. The investor is facing two situations in his head. One is that he's looking at the anticipated gain from investing in that product, which is in the future. It is not here. He is anticipating the gain based on the past performance that I have showed to him. Simultaneously, he is looking at investing that money. That investment is a loss, perceived loss. There are these two separate circuits going on in his head. Now, which circuit is going to be more powerful at that point in time when he's making the decision will actually determine whether or not he will go ahead and invest. So if the loss circuit is more active at that point in time when the guy is making the decision, then that will dominate the anticipated gain circuit. So the gains might be 15% or 20%, but the loss circuit is more powerful at that point in time. What might make the loss circuit more powerful at that point in time? It could be the mood at that point in time. It could be some event which has happened in the last 1 day, 2 days, 1 week, which has changed the power of the loss circuit and so on. So that was in the context of pricing and investment. We also have some interesting thoughts that we know now from neuroscience that actually brands uh, make us behave in different ways, right? So if I'm looking at first choice brand, for instance, it leads to a deactivation of a certain part of my head called the DLPFC, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Now it turns out that the DLPFC, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is involved in reasoning and logic, whereas the VMPFC, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, is an important center for emotion. And so, literally, physiologically, what are we saying? We are saying that now there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that in the presence of a good brand, in the presence of a brand that I like, my emotional centers are more active, and my logical centers, my reasoning centers are less active. So, literally, physiologically, my decision making will be driven by a higher level of emotion rather than reason. And this is something that happens to a whole bunch of us. The more smarter people, of course, hopefully will be able to see this and maybe correct to an extent what is happening over here. Here is some research that we did some years ago where we tried to compare males and females and how they make decisions about their favorite brands. So it turns out that at the age of 18, the engagement with the brand was different by genders. You can see from the arrows, males tended to relate more on cognition, less on affect. Females more on affect, less on cognition. But by 35, it is more or less similar on how one relates to brands. This was one of the early experiments that we had done in this particular area. A more recent experiment that we have done has to do with what happens when we choose weaker brands. So, many times I might want to buy a Samsung phone or an Apple phone, but I may not be able to afford the model that I would like, and so I end up buying either a cheaper model or a brand that's not as nice. So if I buy a cheaper model or a brand that is not as nice, then I'm making a choice of a weaker brand or a weaker product. So when I make a choice as a weaker product or a weaker brand, then what happens in my head? It turns out that I'm actually managing a fair amount of conflict in a particular part of my head, the rostral anterior cingulate cortex, ACC. The conflict is essentially, and this is a paper that just got accepted in Journal of Business Research, the conflict essentially is about I like something which is a better known brand that I have a positive affect for. I cannot afford it, so I'm settling for a weaker brand. The weaker brand is logically more appropriate for myself, so I'm going to choose it. However, because the affect is higher on the other side, there is a sense of conflict within me that I'm resolving. And the decision to go for a weaker brand, therefore, comes from the resolution of this conflict. Only when this conflict is resolved in a satisfactory way do I make a decision in favor of the weaker brand. This is an example from the cosmetics industry. So, uh, the L'Oreal app, which is about how you can buy makeup, for example. So the app, once you download the app, it will take a photograph of your face, and not just, it doesn't just take a photograph of the face, it also makes an estimate of the nature of skin that you have on your face and the bone structure of your face. So whatever makeup you put on your face uh, is determined or should be determined by a combination of the skin type and the bone structure. So this app is able to make an estimate of this, and then based on that, the skin type and the bone structure that you have, the app can suggest that this is what you should be putting. It gives you three or four alternatives, and you can look at those alternatives on the screen, and then you can choose one. So you'll end up choosing the one that makes you feel good, the one that perhaps conserves energy. In this case, feel good is probably the most important. Pattern and contrast relatively less important. And mirroring, of course. If other people have chosen a certain type, you're much more likely to choose. And so the design of the app, the functioning of the app, again links directly to the behaviors that the person is doing. And so therefore behavior science, and underlying the behavior science is how the brain is operating to be able to help us to take a decision in favor of a particular choice that is available to us. So that's how it kind of works for those of you who are interested. So let me close on that note since I'm kind of running out of time. Richa has given me till 10:45 to talk, so we are almost at 10:45. Let me close by making a few statements, a few observations on neuroscience and behavior science, and why it is so important for us going forward to be able to leverage the potential uh, tools to generate better solutions for all of us. Ultimately, as humans, we are behaving in ways that are driven by how our brains work. And the combination of neuroscience and behavioral science allows us to understand how the brain and works, how it results in behavior. So it allows us to make better estimates of what are the possible actions which can take place. And better estimates then, therefore, if I am a policymaker, if I am a company that is trying to do some things, would allow me to generate and design better actions And so therefore, for those of you who are here, I would encourage you to think about how you can develop ideas, questions, and actions based on the combination of neuroscience and behavioral science that allows you to improve the nature of action that you can take. So I'm going to stop there. Stop there. Open to questions. I see one question. There's one question which is decision making to buy or not buy takes place in the prefrontal cortex. So our current understanding uh, is that the decision making happens in an area of the brain which is called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. However, it is considerably influenced by what is happening. So it is still part of the prefrontal cortex, but it is a certain part of the prefrontal cortex. And the decision making is influenced by what is happening in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, DLPFC. It is influenced by what is happening in the amygdala. It is influenced by what is happening in your basal ganglia, in your hindbrain, in your midbrain. So while the decision making or the valuation function that is created in your head happens in a particular part, the actual uh, process that leads to the valuation and the decision and the behavior comes from many other different parts of the head also. It's just that this particular part, the VMPFC, is the place where it all comes together and then results in some kind of action. So thank you very much. I'm actually out of time. So I am going to now stop there and